Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute, and it's my pleasure to host this very special Aerospace Nation. In mid-May, I was invited to visit Ukraine to advise senior members of their defense team about how to optimize the use of air power to turn the tide of battle. Now, if there's any lesson from the Russia-Ukraine war to date, it's the absolute necessity of air power in order to be able to achieve a decisive advantage. That requires strategy, operational concepts, tactics, technology, and training. Now, Russia's failure to establish air superiority from the beginning of the war, despite having a sizable qualitative and quantitative advantage, is one of the biggest reasons their initial offensive in 2022 failed. Now, over 2 years later, a ground-centric, attrition-focused grind defines the war. That's a contest that, from a personnel and a materiel perspective, favors Russia in the long run. If Ukraine is to have a shot at victory, then we need to empower them to break out of this stalemate. And that requires effective air power, plus rules of engagement that allow them to use it decisively. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And to join me in doing that are four long-term friends and senior military leaders who are directly involved in supporting Ukraine while in key positions on active duty. General Phil Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. His tenure included when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. General Tod Wolters, also a former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and the predecessor of General Cavoli, the current SACEUR. We're also joined by General Jeffrey Harrigian, former Commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Africa, and both he and General Wolters were in command when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. I'm also pleased to have join us longtime air power analyst and historian extraordinaire, Dr. Chris Bowie. So gentlemen, welcome. Now, before we begin the conversation with our guests, I'd like to set the stage by sharing some observations from my trip to Ukraine. You can find a more detailed account of these in our latest Mitchell Institute policy paper that we're releasing today, entitled The Significance of Air Superiority, the Ukraine-Russia War. It was drafted by myself in partnership with Dr. Bowie, and it's now posted on our website. The bottom line is, here are the macro takeaways. The key lesson to date is the absolute necessity of air superiority to achieve a decisive military advantage. Air superiority can provide Ukrainian forces the freedom from attack and the freedom to attack that's absolutely necessary for them to achieve advantages relative to the larger and stronger Russian forces. However, from the Ukrainian perspective, that's been a difficult condition to achieve given insufficient resources and capabilities. Furthermore, since the war started, limitations on Ukraine to employ U.S.-provided weapons in Russia have ceded a sanctuary for Russian forces to operate and have yielded them a significant advantage. Within recent weeks, some of those restrictions have been lessened, but they need to be completely removed regarding attacks on any Russian forces, materiel, or infrastructure that could be potentially used against Ukraine. I have yet to witness a football team that ever won by only playing defense alone and who is not allowed to cross the 50-yard line into the opposing team's territory. Guess what? The same thing holds true for war. Now, the second major takeaway is to secure air superiority in the times and places of its choosing, and in order to do so, Ukraine must also evolve its historical doctrine to design and conduct integrated air-ground operations. Only with the kind of integration that creates a synergy between surface and air operations can Ukraine further its military momentum on the battlefield. Third, Ukraine requires weapon systems and munitions in numbers sufficient to achieve strategic gains in the battle space. Inhabited, uninhabited aircraft, precision surface-to-surface weapons, cyber operations, electronic warfare, intelligence, and special ops can all play a significant role if coordinated in an integrated campaign. Fourth, opportunities exist for Ukraine to capitalize on the advantages that low-cost UAVs confer by using them in an integrated fashion with the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, ground-launched cruise missiles, and the Army's Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, to suppress enemy air defenses. In this way, they can help establish air dominance in times and places of Ukraine's choosing. Finally, when it comes to Ukrainian F-16s, they can create effects across a much broader and strategic target set. The F-16 will improve current Ukrainian Air Force capabilities in 3 areas. It brings better radar detection ranges. It brings improved situational awareness and responsiveness with Link 16, and it delivers better threat warning capability over the aircraft they currently have. The F-16 and possibly the Mirage 2000 fighters can also deliver heavy weapons in mass that, with air superiority, can disrupt Russian ground forces and pave the way for Ukrainian Army progress and breakthroughs. Now, in order to achieve these objectives, there are several measures the United States, its NATO allies, and the Ukrainian Air Force can take. As I mentioned before, the United States should immediately remove constraints on U.S. provided weapons. For example, prohibiting ATACMS strikes against air bases that the Russians use to fly glide bomb sorties against Ukraine is an aspect of the escalation management ideology that forces Ukraine to fight as a disadvantage to appease an opponent. Second, the United States and NATO should provide Ukraine with the timely intelligence it needs to make quick and decisive determinations on when and where to employ its forces to achieve windows of air dominance. Third, Ukraine needs to evolve its doctrine beyond its historical Soviet-based foundation that tend to treat aviation as extension of ground forces. And finally, Ukrainian Air Force leadership must be incorporated into the Ukrainian General Staff to foster and facilitate integrated, all-domain concepts, planning, and employment. Now look, this is a complex topic and there's a lot more to it, but these are the main points in our report. So with that, let's dive into the conversation, and don't worry, I've planned for plenty of time to open it up to the audience for questions later. So let's start with Dr. Bowie. Chris, what observations do you have based on your work on our study?
Well, I was in looking at the operations the last several years. What's been apparent is just how the incredible lethality of modern air defenses, where basically you can't penetrate low because of the handheld
man pads,
missile threat, and you can't go medium or high because of the very lethal ground-based air defenses as well as air-to-air aircraft. So we've really come to a situation that was foreseen in the early 1970s after the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 and U.S. experience in Vietnam, that what would happen if we can no longer penetrate. So that led the U.S. Air Force in the 70s to look at unmanned systems. That didn't really pan out, primarily due to technological problems, but also to invest in stealth. So this campaign illustrates the value of stealth that will allow aircraft to penetrate at medium high and gain all the advantages therefore. Second area is just the incredible acceleration of the use of unmanned systems, the drones, medium range, long range strike. I believe the Ukrainians plan to build 1 million per year of these smaller drones that have radically reshape the close-in battle. And they're now investing very heavily in both medium and long-range strike systems. So, previously, long-range strike was a capability that really was only available to advanced powers. It's now proliferating widely across the world, and it's something that we're going to, in the U.S., we're going to have to deal with. And I don't know if we've really come to grips with what that means for the future.
Well, thanks for that. Let's turn to General Breedlove next. We often forget that Russia's current invasion of Ukraine wasn't a one-off. It reflects years of hostile and aggressive behavior. And you were in command when Russia first invaded Crimea in 2014. How did you work to ensure that Putin didn't press further back then?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I noticed that everybody except for Magoo has almost developed the nearly perfect hairline. And so it's good to be among my friends. First of all, as you would imagine, and Magoo can speak to this more, you're dual-hatted as the SAC here. And so you all probably remember the Ukrainians crying over and over, close the skies, because they knew they were going to get hammered from air attack and other types of attack. Little did they know that that would turn into long-range persistent attack. And so the first thing that we did back then is in both headquarters, the NATO headquarters, we tried to develop options for the NAC to consider. And then in my our U.S. headquarters, we developed U.S. sovereign options for how to, quote unquote, close the skies. The point that I think I'd like to make this morning is that all of the options that we really put forward were rejected on both accounts. They were seen as too provocative, and some of them were very, very slight options in order to send a message even to Mr. Putin. But the fear was that anything we did would lead to a more broad invasion. And frankly, I think the things that we didn't do did lead to the more broad invasion that we have seen. But we'll never know. But clearly the fear was that there would be a more broad approach. And I think that because we took no action, we sent a signal. We started talking all the way back in 2014 about the two things that we feared the most in America, and that was acceleration to a nuclear exchange or more broad involvement of the conflict in Europe. And so what we've seen for the past 10 years, we need to remember now that this war is really 10 years old, not 2.25 years old. But what we've seen for the last 10 years is that Russia plays back to us on almost a weekly or biweekly basis the two messages that we told them fear the most. We always hear about nuclear things. Russia brings it up about every 7 to 8 days. We always hear about a broader war. Russia brings that up on about every 7 to 14 days. And oh, by the way, about half of those messaging include that little caveat of, and of course, once again, American soldiers will die on the battlefields of Europe. And so Mr. Putin's campaign of intimidation is his most capable weapon. Secondly, the way we in NATO then began, and the U.S. began, to approach how to give Mr. Putin pause was to restructure the readiness of NATO. In the Wales summit, we made some of the biggest changes to that date. Magoo and others went on to make even bigger changes later, but we made some of the most impactful changes to NATO readiness that we've ever seen. And then one point of pride. At one point, the NAC would take no action as far as our air policing. And I offered to President Obama and the SecDef an option of U.S. sovereign action using U-Safety assigned forces, so there would not have to be a deployment. And the United States, the Liberty Wing, put cap over the 3 Baltic nations. From 18 hours from me saying go, we had armed cap over the three Baltic nations. And shortly thereafter, NATO nations started joining us. And shortly thereafter, NATO changed air policing to adapt what the U.S. was doing. And so I'm pretty proud of what we did in a U.S. unilateral setting to get things started. I think I'll stop there, Zator.
Oh, thanks very much for those insights. Let's shift to General Wolters and General Harrigian. I think we were all really shocked in 2022 when Russian forces launched their attack absent what I think we'd all term competent air power 101, because they failed to secure air superiority. They struggled to strike targets in a decisive fashion. They clearly failed to defend their own forces against attack. What were your key takeaways from the opening phases of the invasion from your command perspectives? Magoo, why don't you kick that off?
Thanks, Zator. And again, thanks for having us. And it's good to be with old friends, and it's nice to get to say hi to Chris for the first time in a long time. The big strategic objectives when late February of 2022 came about from the United States and from NATO were number one, maintain NATO solidarity. Number two, support Ukraine. And number three, don't initiate a war with Russia on Ukrainian soil. And when you step through those objectives, you start to get into a pinch with respect to where we are today. Our observations with respect to Russian employment were a little bit surprising. And I think Cobra, who at the time was our air component commander, would tell you that their ability to integrate at the point of impact was just not what we suspected it would be. And we were pleasantly surprised that they stalled to the degree that they did. And I would contend that not just how well they integrated from an air-land perspective, as we all know, Russia has a significant cyber capability. They obviously have a significant maritime capability to put pinches on the periphery of the attacks. So all that in unison from a strategic plan, from our standpoint, wasn't executed very well. And as day 10 hit and day 20 hit and day 30 hit, Cobra Harrigian and I were pleasantly surprised with their inability to adequately integrate in the air domain coupled with the land domain to include the other domains. On the blue side of the house, with respect to Cobra's activities in the air, as well as the maritime and the land and the cyber, what NATO was able to do was finally make the decisions with the North Atlantic Council that Buana was talking about, that he pushed hard to achieve from 2014 to 2017. And as you pointed out, Zator, this conflict isn't just a couple of years old. It started in 2014. And the challenge that NATO has is, like all large organizations, it's not necessarily innovation, it's adoption of what needs to take place strategically. So adopting those foundational elements that Buana was talking about just doesn't happen overnight. And thank goodness there was great planning from 2014 to 2016 in Buana's day. And all of those options that he proposed to the North Atlantic Council at NATO and to the United States Joint Staff and the government, all those options were reused 5 to 6 years later and posed. And what we were able to do with the great work of Cobra and his other component commanders was protect NATO sovereign territory within hours of the start of the campaign. So in air, in land, in sea, in space, in cyber, Cobra's sovereign territory of Europe, what was protected, and air superiority was achieved very, very quickly, coupled with maritime superiority at the operational and tactical levels, to include the strategic levels of making sure that we could secure access in the Baltic Sea, the Arctic Sea, as well as the Eastern Mediterranean, and do the right things to make sure that ultimately we had a decent disposition in the Black Sea. So the work that took place in Buana's day took about 5 to 6 years to be adequately adopted and put into print and executed by NATO and the United States, and allowed NATO to quickly make decisions that they hadn't been accused of doing in previous years, but now they were kind of getting up to speed. So all of that went pretty decently. Now the next strategic chore is getting the Ukrainian armed forces up to speed in all domains to make sure that they would now be in a position to protect their sovereign territory. And as you talked about at the beginning, Zaytar, you have to have the concepts, you have to have the planning, and you have to have the employment. And that stuff just doesn't come overnight. And this has been an iterative process that General Cavoli is in the middle of, and General Hecker, who was General Harrigian's replacement, is in the middle of. They're working to find ways to make sure that from a planning and employment perspective, with the addition of F-16s and Mirage 2000s and HIMARS and ATACMs that have an ability to range, that we do so in a prudent manner to where we can achieve campaign momentum on the Ukrainian side. Then I'll stop there.
Cobra?
Yeah, again, thanks, Zaytar, for having us. Great to be here with a bunch of world-class leaders and great Americans. So I think an important part from my perspective was a little bit of the history that I had with the Russians in Syria. As you'll recall, I had been the ascent commander before General Wolters brought me over. So I spent 2 years kind of watching how they employed, not only from an air perspective, but probably more importantly, how they were attempting to integrate with the joint players in the battle space there. Now, acknowledging it was a significantly different operational environment, it gave me, I think, an opportunity to highlight to my intelligence folks in particular, and General Wolters and I had lots of conversations about this, with respect to how would they be able to do the types of integrated activities that not only would gain air superiority up front, but also be able to support their ground troops. And my perspective was that, first off, as we all understand, gaining air superiority doesn't just happen. It comes with the right capabilities, the right TTPs and concepts. And then there's a level of professionalism and training that's required to be able to execute that. And as you view this holistically, from my perspective, and we had some really good insights early on, they had some significant challenges there that ultimately, as both General Wolters and I worked with the Ukrainians, we tried to help them think through how they could optimize some of the inabilities of the Russians to be able to operate in that environment that could facilitate, stretching this out, giving them time and space to now work through what ultimately would be an opportunity to give them other areas to capitalize on going forward. I think the other thing that I would highlight, and this is something that General Wolters and I spent a lot of time talking about, is the professionalism of the Russian Air Force, and what does that mean, and how does that correlate to the specific skill sets that would be required to gain air superiority. And you could write another book on that, Zaytar, and I'm sure you will someday, but that is something that I think, as we view the way Western forces work and the way that particularly across NATO, we operate together, not only as an air component, but as a joint force, there's a significant difference there that I believe over time we want to bring to the Ukrainians and work with them to help them appreciate what that culture needs.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there and give that 2 double thumbs up. It was evident from, and all of you having been there, done that, recognize that there's a long way to go in the context of the doctrine that the Ukrainians grew up with. I mean, it was Soviet doctrine. And so what we tend to, I don't know if we take it for granted, but we've been working on how do we integrate our forces when we bring them together to fight since Goldwater Nichols in 1986. So it isn't something that happens overnight, and that integration is something that is a real challenge that they're going to need to work on. General Breedlove, Juana, let me shift to you. Russia wasn't alone when it came to air power challenges. Ukraine had severely underinvested in its Air Force for years, and their pilots did the best they could and did a good job, I may say, to defend against the invasion. but they faced a heck of a lot of challenges. And as Cobra just mentioned, air power is not something that can be generated overnight. So how should this experience inform decision-making in the region, to include here in the United States, when it comes to fielding ready and sufficient air power capacity? Your thoughts?
I think I'll go quick because we want to get to questions, but it's all been said already that you don't just generate these capabilities. Seed, which is an important part of establishing the control of the battlefield for either Russia or Ukraine, and both of them failed to do effective seed. You don't learn this overnight, and it's hard business. And if we don't maintain our proficiency at it, our investment at it, and our training and evaluation of it, we'll lose it just like they've lost it. But I believe that neither Air Force, Ukraine's nor Russia's, came to the battlefield with those basic capabilities we're talking about. Being able to do seed, then expressing air, even local air superiority over troops, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that were lost. And so we really see on the battlefield in Ukraine the result of a lack of air power. And that's this ugly attritional battle that's going on. And I would like to bring a couple of words that most of our audience will understand, but Russia to me is unable to really do counter power capabilities. They are doing counter value capabilities, not counter force. We see more attacks knocking down civilian structures than attacking the Ukrainian military. And so they've really lost it. So I want to get off the stage very quickly with a series of questions to us, because your point is very important. What are we learning about what we see? Not only what is Ukraine learning about what we see. Is NATO ready to do seed minus the U.S. Air Force? I would offer probably not. Is NATO ready to do air defense versus air policing? Air defense is a skill that we don't practice very much in NATO. We are focused on air policing and some new names we've given it. And is NATO really ready to do Article 5 level of support to ground forces? If we're able to do seed, if we're able to accomplish local air superiority to enable the Army to maneuver and to enable us to attack, then are we as a team in NATO ready to do that level and type of attack that gives the Army the ability to do what we call modern maneuver warfare? Over.
Yeah, hey, those are all great points. I can't help but tie this together a bit. Chris, at the beginning, talked about the significance of surface-to-air defenses that have grown significantly in capability. But to your point, Buana, and I go back to, and, pardon me, but as part of the experience, in Desert Storm, Baghdad was the most highly defended city in history. It had greater air defenses and surface-to-air missile systems and interceptors and AAA than downtown Hanoi during Vietnam, or even Moscow during the height of the Cold War. Yet in 24 hours, Allied forces were operating with impunity over Baghdad. So it's not that, these surface-to-air missile systems provide an invulnerable capability. They don't, which gets the importance of suppression of enemy air defenses and creative ways to do it, particularly in today's world with cyber capabilities, special operations, and many other things. So that's not something we should forget, and I think your points are spot on. Now, General Wolters, today's fight, as Buana just mentioned, looks an awful lot like World War I, in attrition-dominated slugfest on the ground. Russia wins that math contest in the long run, and that's not in our interest, especially with China watching. So how do we change the calculus? I laid out some thoughts up front, but I'm really curious about your perspectives. So if you would, let's start with strategy. What are some of the macro level objectives you'd seek with air power to favor Ukraine?
employ the air power in a NATO, Ukrainian, U.S. environment with integrated all-domain offense. So in air, land, sea, space, and cyber, you are integrated, and from a concept planning and employment perspective, you are ready. And many times, General Harrigian and I had conversations about the readiness of the Ukrainian armed forces. And the first setback was that all-domain offensive employment capability and that all-domain defensive employment capability. And today, as you just characterized, Zatar, it looks a lot like World War One. And there are activities that are taking place, certainly in cyber, certainly in space, certainly in the maritime, and certainly in the air that aren't talked about. But all of those domains, coupled with the land domain from an integration perspective, can spell and get us towards more favorable, positive campaign momentum for the Ukrainian armed forces. And again, just as you and Chris have pointed out, none of this can happen overnight. And one of the big challenges that we initially saw was from a readiness perspective, which includes the degree of lethality that your forces have, which is part of integration in the air domain and the land domain. Ukraine was very challenged, and they're still challenged. And Russia is obviously even so more challenged. But just as you said, but by not taking advantage comprehensively of those other domains, we lose the large advantage that we as a NATO can support Ukraine with, and Ukraine currently possesses. But we still have a ways to go with this. It's really easy to sit and have a conversation and say that we're integrated, air, land, sea, space, cyber. And Russia said that to themselves. They were convinced on February 19th and February 22nd that they were adequately integrated in air, land when they were going to cross the border. They were way off the mark. So it's a difficult task. And I do agree we can boost our lethality and boost towards positive campaign momentum by shoring up activities in the air domain to complement what is taking place in the land domain. But space matters, cyber matters, and obviously the maritime matters. So as we make those advances, we need to ensure that all domains that we're leveling the playing field as we continue to advance, and don't overlook some domains that may be future vulnerabilities against Russia. But the two biggies right now are land and air. And I believe a boost in the air domain, coinciding with the other domains, is something that we have to continue to work towards. And we're getting there. It just takes a long time. And when you start introducing, finally bringing F-16s into the equation, integrating those appropriately with ATACMS and HIMARS at range, now you're starting to get to the point to where you're making some significant advances in multiple domains. And I'll stop there.
Very good. Thanks very much for that. General Harrigian is the air commander with time in theater during some critical events. Are there some specific centers of gravity that, if negated, would yield an outsized impact in the current fight?
Yeah, thanks. I saw that question previously, and I spent a little time thinking about it because it's not an easy question. And, I think as we step back and I look at how they got started from the Ukrainian perspective, it was largely defensive. And we use the term agile combat employment to be creative and move their forces around in a way that allowed them basically to survive, which was a good thing. And now what we're talking about, and General Wolters was hitting on it, was, okay, how do you generate from a broader campaign perspective some momentum that is facilitated by, first, I'll call it an operational level plan that we need to, I think, work with them that would highlight then those specific targets that would be centers of gravity from an operational perspective, whether those be forces, as General Breedlove highlighted, or I think thinking our way through some asymmetric targets, whether it be power generation, there's a myriad of different domains they could go after with the capabilities they have. But I think the critical piece here is first start with the plan, because they're going to have to work through TTPs that would actually allow them to execute the vision that would be facilitated by the targeting that I know from my engagements with some of our friends that are still in USAF, we're trying to help them with. And I think taking those targets and then laying that out in a manner that incrementally, not overnight, allows them to gain confidence in the capabilities they have from all domains is the path they ought to think their way through, and we should find ways to help them.
Very good. Appreciate that. Generals Breedlove and Wolters, putting your Supreme Allied Commander hats back on to execute an effective campaign requires that the U.S. and the Western coalition eliminate the restrictions on the weapons we've provided. Now, you've both worked in advising senior political leadership before. To the degree that you can, could you walk us through some of the dynamics at play in making those kinds of recommendations?
I'll jump on that hand grenade first. So this is bigger than air power. You know, we are air power purveyors and we love it, but it's bigger than air power. And to me, it's really about the most senior leadership in our nation during my time and during Magoo's time. We are nearly completely deterred right now. Mr. Putin's war of intimidation, his war of disinformation, have our senior leaders basically kowtowed as to the options that are out there. And there are a myriad of options that I think could be considered and used. And so our first step really is to become undeterred. You know, all of us went to war college and we studied the old dead guys, and they said them in different words and different languages, but two things all of them said was deter your enemy, don't allow him to deter you, seek the initiative and maintain the initiative. And we have blown both of those. We are deterred and we are reactive to what is going on, led by Russia. We do not really take the initiative against Russia because, again, we're deterred. So I just want to lift the whole thing up one level above air power and say, we in the West need to become undeterred. We need to stand up and have moral courage to address this info fair that Mr. Putin is using to control our. Some people like to call it reflexive control. I don't know how widely the audience uses those words, but we need to step up.
Magoo?
Yeah, Zaytar, just a little bit of the mechanics behind the scene as far as touch points in convincing your own government and your own alliance the prudent path that should be executed. So as this campaign started, there is a ton of back and forth at my level with our own joint staff, at my level with our own National Security Council, and then less so on occasion at my level with the president, but often with the Secretary of Defense. And in each nation that is a member of NATO, their military commanders have to ensure that they are aligned inside of their own nation's government all the way through each one of those wickets that I just alluded to, up to the prime minister or president, that this plan of attack is prudent. And as we've talked about a million times before in NATO, in order to get NATO to do something, you have to have consensus. So you have to be prepared to have 32 separate governmental conversations to convince the masses that this is the flight path to take. What was most important at the beginning of this campaign was to protect the sovereign soil of NATO. And what we knew was going to be a factor is ultimately restoring the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And we're good planners in America. We're good planners in many of our NATO nations. And making sure that what you're doing now and what you think you'll have to be doing 2 years from now is putting you on glide path to achieve success. And as you can well imagine, Zaytar, you've been through this 1,000 times. Words matter, and it's difficult to take a complex, complicated military plan and go into a group of senior civilian leaders and be able in 30 minutes or 1 hour to adequately communicate what is taking place. So you have to work your tail off. Cobra did it 1,000 times to make sure that you basically use one sentence to communicate 3 hours worth of information. Because to us, it's very simple, but to our senior civilian leaders, and justifiably so, it's pretty difficult. But the big challenge is, where do you think we're going to be 2 years from now? And we asked ourselves that multiple times at the end of February 2022. And most of us, taking a look at warfare from a global perspective, realize that wars never end as fast as you would prefer. They typically go on far longer than anybody anticipated. And you better have steady, positive military campaign momentum so that you can achieve strategic victory. And from a NATO perspective, what we said back in February of 2022, we in the U.S. military, we in the NATO military, was we cannot lose. And we need to image our way through the next several years and ensure that the Ukrainian armed forces are in a position to where, when it's time to transition to taking back their territory that they could potentially give up, that they possess the capabilities to do that. And now we get into the offensive side, the strike side, all of the things that you talked about in your opening, Zaytar, that we are in a position after 2 years of great coaching, really after 10 years of great coaching in all domains, we are starting to get to the point to where we can take advantage of offensive capabilities. And now at the military level, I believe that we're getting closer and closer to be able to do that. And now the heavy lift on our senior military members from a NATO perspective and a U.S. perspective is to go to those governments and give that 30-second elevator speech that adequately describes what needs to take place in all domains to seize the offensive, get the campaign momentum back on the Ukrainian side, be in a position to where irreversibly Ukraine becomes a member of NATO in 6 months, 2 years, or 3 years from now. And those are the kinds of campaign momentum items that we have to be prepared to do. But as you know, Zaytar, you did this, and Chris did this back in the 1988, 1989, 1990 timeframe. Those adult conversations with your senior civilian leaders are difficult. And most of it stems from, it's really, really hard to communicate exactly what it is we're attempting to do in the near term and the far term. But we've got to get on that wagon. We're starting to get there, and we need to continue to put pressure on it to get those policy shifts to where we can begin to strike targets at range that are critical military infrastructure that Russia possesses, that they are using against Ukraine to strike Ukrainian sovereign soil. And those are certainly justifiable targets in anybody's observation. I'll stop there.
Wow. Well, thank you both very much for those insights that folks don't generally get that often. And thank all of you for participating today. I've got more questions, but I want to open this up to our audience. And I think all of you know the drill by now. So when I call on you, please unmute your mic and then state your name and affiliation before asking your question. You can also submit questions using the Q&A function. We've got a bunch of those here. So let's kick this off with the first question to Michael Gordon from the Wall Street Journal. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm disappointed that I don't have a cool call sign like you guys. So my question is the following. There's been a lot of media attention, of which I've been a part, on the prospective delivery of F-16s to Ukraine. But as you folks know better than others, it's not just a platform. It's going to have to involve avionics, munitions, command and control arrangements, contractor maintenance, and the like. So my question is, as a system of capabilities, what's really necessary to make the F-16 of optimal utility for the Ukrainians? And how would you guard against the very real risk that these aircraft are going to be highly vulnerable to Russian air defenses and standoff capabilities from Russian Federation territory? Whoever wants to take that.
Hey, Michael, this is Tod Wolters. I'll go ahead and take a stab at it. And I'd like to flip it to Commander Harrigian, who worked a lot of these issues. The big piece, Michael, and the conversations that were had several years ago were obviously along the lines of let's give the Ukrainians F-16s right now. And there were many people across the land in the United States and inside of several European nations that wanted the F-16 to go in to Kyiv as soon as possible. But what we couldn't do was insert a sophisticated system that would demonstrate failure and be in a position to where the enemy, and as you well know, Michael, the Russians do a good job of lying in the public domain from an information standpoint. We didn't want to offer an olive branch of immediate strategic failure to give the Russians an advantage. And we were smart enough to know that a sophisticated system, which HIMARS is, 155 millimeter is, ATACMS are, these systems have to have the maintainability and the sustainability in a wartime environment. And the environment that receives them has to be mature enough to be able to move jets to multiple bases and still be able to maintain them to a degree where they can become airworthy. And you just have to have the operational force, the pilots that have the proficiency to do some pretty sophisticated stuff. And most people believe that you can just kind of put an Air Force pilot in the corner of a room and pour some salt and pepper on their head. And 2 seconds later, you've got a lethal product that can go out and whip the enemy. It takes time, it takes training, and that's what's been going on in a very heavy-handed manner back in the U.S. and back in many of our European nations to get this sophisticated system into the environment, knowing now that it's got the sustainability and the maintainability to be effective, and also knowing that our operational force is nested with a Ukrainian armed force that has the ability to integrate that F-16 in land, in sea, in space, in cyber, to be effective to where we're convinced, the Ukrainian armed forces are convinced, the NATO armed forces are convinced that this will produce positive campaign momentum and there won't be a strategic setback. But there's a lot that has to happen below the surface on this, and General Harrigian knows it better than anybody. And I'll stop there if you don't mind, Cobra, and flip it to you for a little bit of icing on the cake.
Yeah, thanks, General Walters. In my mind, like you said, there's a whole bunch of moving parts associated with this, but continuing to focus back on the people and ensuring collectively, from the maintainers to the air battle managers to the pilots, that we, and I'll use kind of the NATO perspective, have touch points across all of those and have synchronized it in a manner that incrementally we bring this capability along in a manner that facilitates the Ukrainians having trust and confidence in the system, understanding the constraints they have from a capability perspective, recognizing that it's going to take some time, will be something that we've got to do together with them. In my mind, this is skin in the game from not just the U.S. perspective, but NATO nations, which is happening down at the European Training Center in Romania today, is a great place that they come together and we can have the type of mind meld that'll be required to make sure that collectively we understand where they're at, they understand where they're at, and now they can, over time, move out smartly in a manner that generates the momentum that General Walters was talking about.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Michael, for the question and the answers by both General Walters and General Harrigian. I've got one here on chat from Honorable Matt Donovan. And Matt opens up with, "Good to see you all. Thanks for doing this. And I've always admired Magoo's hairline." This is primarily a military conversation, and rightly so. But someone once said, war is an extension of politics by other means. My question is, what can the U.S. do, particularly using air power, to help Ukraine set the strategic conditions to extract maximum conciliations in anticipation of a negotiated settlement?
Well, I'll offer there's really two sort of tracks to this conversation. The downside, our ability to do what Matt is talking about is currently limited by our policies. Our policies will have to loosen up. Magoo and others have covered it. And you said it early in your remarks, Zaytar. we are now allowing Ukraine to strike a limited target set. And I think that a more broad application of that policy, such that Ukraine is able to strike any target generating military power attacking into Ukraine, that would make a big difference. And then giving them the wherewithal, because F-16s will take a while. I love it. You know, I flew it for almost 24 years off and on, and it's going to make a difference, but that's down the line. In short term, it's about long-term strike capability like ATACMs and being able to use them more broadly. The other thing for strategic conditions is that we, as an alliance, are now sort of embracing building air power in Ukraine, but we are doing it at a trickles pace. And even if we sped up, it will be a long time before what we're doing truly has a strategic impact on the battlefield. I think we need to make a decision now to speed up the pace of creating these capabilities, all the time building a restraint in the fact that if we use them too early and piecemeal, we're likely to lose them. And so it's a strategic patience, but it's also a strategic acceleration of what we're trying to do. Over.
Anyone else want to chime in there? Okay. Yeah, go
Zator,
ahead.
if I could, I would just, I agree completely with what Buana just talked about. And with respect to Matt Donovan's question on what does it specifically bring, I would just bring it down a notch below what Buana is talking about to add. When you as a nation possess the capability in an extremely successful, sophisticated fashion to put targets at risk, at range, with pinpoint accuracy and precision, like we want the Ukrainians to be able to do. The number of vulnerabilities that creates for the attacking country, in this case Russia, are enormous. It's a completely different level of warfare. And obviously the targets that we would put at risk in Russia are those that are critical military infrastructures that we're very aware of, that we have indications and warning on, that we have command and control of, and in an international court of discussion are very, very legitimate targets because, as Buana said, they are striking from those infrastructure areas into Ukraine. And when we can finally adequately deter and defend ourselves as the Ukrainian armed forces, this dramatically increases the uncertainty and the vulnerabilities in the Russian government, in the Russian population about what the heck it is that they're doing, causing thousands and thousands of Russians to be unnecessarily killed by their Putin administration. So I just think that the air power element of this that Matt Donovan was getting to allows us to create significant strategic vulnerabilities for Russia as this war progresses from a strategic standpoint.
Okay, here's one from John Turpak here at the Air and Space Forces Association magazine. We're always looking for a silver bullet. Our leaders refer to St. HIMARS as having had a huge disruptive effect. Is there a truly disruptive system that has not been used yet that would really rock the Russians back on their heels? Is that the F-16s, or maybe JASSM, or maybe something else? Panel?
I'll jump on this one more time, but the other guys might add more. We often are looking, as was noted, for silver bullets. I would broaden the application. We recently had a White House spokesperson, John Kirby, say publicly that we're giving Ukraine everything that it needs to win. I could not disagree with John more. He used to work with me and for me, and I know him well, but he's now in a very political position, and he's carrying a political message. We are not giving Ukraine everything they need. If you would just simply answer the question, what would a U.S. force take to this fight? All of these silver bullet things would start to shake out. We probably don't need one issue. What we need is the ability to broadly use, as Magoo was just saying, broadly use those tools that we bring to the fight that are an integrated ability to hold Russian targets at risk before the Russian forces can be brought to bear on Ukraine. We have to wait for them to come across the border now, largely, except for in a couple areas that we've authorized. We have to wait for Russia to fire or strike before we respond. And we need to break out of that and use all the tools. And a JASM, of course, is a much longer range weapon than we've talked about before and would hold targets much deeper in Russia at risk. These are all big things that could be used to influence the fight. It's just a matter, as we've said over and over, of our current policy self-limiting what Ukraine can do.
Okay, anyone else want to add anything to General Breedlove?
Hey, Zaytar, just quickly, I think the other piece of this, we spend a lot of time talking about the policy, but there's also an intelligence and targeting piece of this when it comes to, refining the campaign and where they go. And you know this better than any, but how do you link that together to achieve that momentum? And that's a piece, I don't know how that's working today. I know General Wolters and I did a lot of work to try to facilitate that. I would suspect there's been progress, but that would be an area that would really, I think, offer them an opportunity to not only demonstrate that, hey, you understand the vulnerabilities of the Russians, and here's places you can go after. And then there's the mass piece. So you've got some range issues we've got to work through, and then you got to be able to generate enough of it that you can actually increase the momentum that's required to start moving them back. Over.
Oh, very good. We're coming up to the end of our block. So here's one from Doug Burns that I'm going to offer to anyone who wants to jump in and answer it. The fight in Ukraine is occurring at a time when the U.S. Air Force is the oldest and smallest in its history and facing serious challenges modernizing. We just spoke about the challenges Ukraine's facing given its air power limitations. Yet here we are in our own country struggling to maintain our own air power advantage. Thoughts on that issue and perspective, any perspectives you'd like to share with the Congress?
If I could, Zaytar, I'll just make a quick point and flip it to Buana and Cobra and Chris, so I know have points. As a combatant commander in the United States of America, you have a responsibility statutorily to support the terrain that's in your area of responsibility, basically Europe. And in doing so, you have to, while you're working in Europe, you have to look west back at the Pentagon to the services in the U.S. Department of Defense. And you have to be an adult when it comes to the demand signal that you send back to Washington, D.C. Number one, you have to win. You must win as a combatant commander. You cannot lose. And part of losing is being such a demanding customer that you drain the service chiefs of the arrows in their quiver to do anything, whether it's people, whether it's parts, whether it's hardware and it's software. Today, we're more sophisticated in integrating combatant commanders with service chiefs and the demands back in Washington, D.C. And truly, connecting all those dots is part of strategic warfighting. And it's just as important to make sure that you have an understanding of the service chief's challenges as it is to make sure you have an understanding of your forces on the continent. And we do a better job of that today than we did 20 years ago or 10 years ago, only because we pride ourselves as a U.S. Department of Defense is getting smarter every day. But it's a huge consideration and one that I would say strategically you have to bring into your cross-check. And I know Buana's got something to add on that. Over.
I'll just really quickly say, as the vice chief, I was the provider, and then as the combatant commander, I was the user. And as Magoo has pointed out, this is a delicate dance out there. And one of the things that we forget, and we don't forget, but one of the things that a lot of people forget is that readiness is sort of in two baskets. Current readiness is how we're maintaining, investing in our current kit and keeping our current kit and pilots and forces ready to generate today. And then the trade-off, of course, is future kit, which is future readiness and capabilities. And so I think that we have to support our leaders and give them every input and encouragement that we can to understand that balance, that we have to not only be ready to solve the problems of the three commanders here on this program, but also to be prepared to be ready for the commanders that will follow us and follow those that follow us. And this is not an easy problem to solve. I didn't have any answers. I just want to remind that we have this internal balance that we have to.
If 30 seconds, I know we're at time. So the global dynamics continue to change rapidly. But as an Air Force, our job has remained the same, and that's to provide freedom of maneuver for our joint force. That's our job. We can't forget that. And we've got to be prepared to make the deliberate, logical arguments to those that are senior leaders at the political level that maybe it's time we relook the way money is distributed across the services and who's getting what and for what reason. And that's a hard conversation. But as an Air Force team, I think we've got to be prepared to walk in there, roll our sleeves up, and fight for what we know is right, because without it, the joint force won't be able to win. And that's the hard discussion that needs to happen.
Yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm going to just conclude that question with the reality that the demands on the United States Air Force exceed the resources that it has been provided. And the United States Air Force has been under-resourced for over 30 years, and that's why we're in the pickle that we are today. So as all of you have stated in one way or another, this isn't just an Air Force issue. This is about ensuring that our joint forces have the capabilities to provide combatant commanders the forces that they need to win. And that means a greater investment to recapitalize our geriatric Air Force. So with that, unfortunately, we've come to the end of this Aerospace Nation. I want to thank you again, General Wolters, General Breedlove, General Harrigian, and Dr. Bowie for taking the time to speak with us today. And Chris, a special thanks on the great work on the paper. So from all of us at Mitchell Institute, have a great Air and Space Power kind of day.
Thanks, Atar.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks. See you.